Today we'll talk about solving 1 and 2 step equations. Now, before we get started, let's talk about a couple parts, I guess, if you will, of a pretty standard equation. If we just kind of take a look at this one, this is just one I just made up. The number 4, okay, that's what we call a coefficient. Coefficient. Now, coefficient is simply a number that's being multiplied by a variable. Obviously, the y in this case would be called the variable. The minus sign and even the equal sign, those things have a name too, and those are in a category that's called the operation. And then numbers that don't have variables, so like the 6 and the 3 right there, those are what we call constants because their value is constant. Versus a variable, that could be different things. But numbers without variables are called constants. Numbers that are being multiplied by a variable is called a coefficient. So let's just talk about the basics here of solving one-step equations. Okay, they're called one-step because that's exactly what it should take. It should just take one step to solve. And the basic rule that we want to follow is we're going to try and isolate the variable by undoing an operation, meaning there are 4 basic operations that we're going to talk about: add, subtract, multiply, divide. And there's obviously, they partner up: add and subtract, and then multiply and divide. And add and subtract are what we would call opposite operations, and multiply and divide are. And so most times when I look at a problem and I'm going to try and get this variable by itself, what I'm going to do is I'm going to undo the operation. So if this is minus, I'm actually going to add 5 to both sides. Okay, so what I'm doing right there is that's, if you remember back to our properties, that's the inverse property of addition. Because if I have negative 5 plus 5, those will cancel. And that's what we want to do. We want it to cancel. So we just have an x there. 12 plus 5 is 17. And there you go. You just solved it. All right, same thing over here with number 2. You see it says x plus 9. So I'm going to undo that by subtracting 9. So those cancel, and I get x equals 3 minus 9 is negative 6. Now you have to be a little careful because when I look at a problem like number 13, notice it's been flipped around a little bit here, and it says x and there's a plus sign. And so I'm not going to subtract 4 here. Okay, I'm actually going to add 4 here. And that is because negative 4 plus 4 cancel to become 0. 15 plus 4 is 19. Okay? Now let's move on to some multiplication and division. Notice this next one says 3x equals 15. Well, what operation is going on between the 3 and the x? Well, it's multiplication. So I'm going to do the opposite of that, which would be division. So I'm going to divide. And 3 divided by 3 is 1, so those cancel. And 15 divided by 3 is 5. And it doesn't matter whether they're positive or negatives. This says negative 4x equals 16, so I'm going to divide by a negative 4. Now be careful, make sure you're dividing by a negative, because that way your numbers or your coefficient in this number cancel completely. You get x equals 16 divided by negative 4 is negative 4. Okay, now let's talk about a special case here. There's a special case when it comes to multiplying when you deal with fractions. Now normally, like we did these last two, when it's multiplication, we divide it. Well, let's think back here for a moment. Remember when you first started doing any operation involving fractions. And we would, when you divided by a fraction, okay, so like for instance, let's do a quick, let's say I had 2/3 divided by a half. Did you actually ever divide by a half? No, you didn't. You actually changed this to multiplication and multiplied by the reciprocal. So you never actually divided by a fraction. You actually multiplied by the reciprocal. Well, that's what we want to do here. Here it says 1/2 x equals 3. We don't want to divide by a half. Okay, instead, we're going to multiply by the reciprocal. And the reason why that's good is because now you notice the 2's cancel. You get x equals 6. Okay, so kind of a special case right there, something to make note. So let's try another one like that. Okay, this next one says 2/5 x equals 4. So I'd multiply by the reciprocal, which is 5 over 2. Okay, these would cancel, and I get x equals 4 times 5 over 2. Well, that's 4 over 1. Let's do a little cross canceling. 2 goes into 2 once, is twice. We get x equals 10. Okay, so that's really the only thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of special case when it comes to problems that involve multiplication. The last type we're going to talk about is division. Like this one. This one says x divided by 4 equals 20. Well, the opposite of dividing is to multiply. So I'm actually going to multiply by 4 on both sides. And again, these cancel. Get x equals 80. Okay, so that's one-step equations. But what if we have something where there's more than one step, such as 2 steps? So when you are doing something that involves more than one step, you have a choice to make. Okay, you might be asking yourself, all right, well, this one has -2, but it also says divide by 3. So which one do I undo first? Well, normally it's the opposite of order of operations. So in order of operations, you normally do multiply, divide, then add, subtract. Well, when you're solving an equation, you're going to go the opposite direction. So you're going to undo your add, subtract first, and then your multiply and divide. Most times. That's usually a pretty good rule of thumb to follow. So when I look at this one, I'm going to add 2. And notice how I am showing my work and keeping it neat. And now it's x divided by 3 equals 12. So I'm going to multiply by 3, just like we just got done doing in the problem before. So we get x equals 36. Then how do I know if that's right? Well, you can always take your answer and plug it back in to see if this left side does equal the right. And if you do plug in 36, you'll see that it does. All right, let's talk about number 2 here. What can we do? Again, don't get stuck. This says plus. We're not going to subtract. We're actually going to add 4. So these cancel. And I get 1/2 x equals 10. Okay, it's one of our special cases here. We're not going to divide by a half. We're going to multiply by the reciprocal. X equals 20, just like that. Okay, last one. Well, let's take a look at this one. This would be a good one for you to try on your own, maybe. Hit pause and see what happens. All right, let's see if you did it right. Here, you notice I'm not going to add 7. Okay, because it says minus a negative. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do, some of us might have heard the phrase same, change, change. I'm going to do same, leave this alone, and I'm going to change, change. Or the minus and a negative basically cancel each other. I'm going to subtract 7. So we get negative 3x equals negative 14 minus 7 is negative 21. Divide by negative 3. X equals 7. And there you go. That's solving 1- and 2-step equations.